To Stand Alone, the untold story of anti-slavery advocate Edward COLES by Ryan Kaminski. Mornings, afternoons, and evenings. From the fall of 1804 until January 31st, 1865. An explosion of cannon fire is heard, followed by a flash of red. Amidst the screams and pleas of dying men, two soldiers emerge. Henry Sawyer, carrying a gun and wearing a Union Army uniform. A Confederate soldier, carrying a gun and wearing a Confederate Army uniform. They two notice each other and begin to raise their guns. The two finish raising their guns.
These honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for why they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The two finish raising their guns and aim. As they are about to fire, they freeze. A newspaper boy holding a newspaper rests with an additional stack of papers beside him.
January 31st, 1865. Congress set to vote today on the proposed 13th Amendment. Read all about it in the latest edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Will the amendment pass or will it fail? What will today's vote mean for the nation's slaves? How about it, ma'am? Read about what the experts are saying?
The amendment was supposed to pass months ago, and it didn't. It won't pass now. I don't need no newspaper to tell me that. And as for the experts, they said there would never be a war to begin with. And look at us now.
Don't beat the drums of war unless you're ready to fight. I beat my drums and you beat yours. And this country has been beating its drums for longer than I care to remember. Oh, Hester!
I'm sorry, Mr. Coles. I didn't mean to startle you. I was upstairs and I didn't hear you come in.
If anyone should be apologizing, it's me. Here I am rambling to myself without realizing it. I'm not alone. Please come in. Sit down, relax, would you?
Thank you, Mr. Coles, but I've barely started my work.
Hester, how long have you been working for me?
Since last May.
And since then, how many times have I asked you to drop the Mr. Coles business and start calling me Edward?
More times than I can count.
So when are you finally going to start honoring my requests?
I'm sorry, sir, but to be perfectly honest, I've never had an employer be this informal before.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you've never had an employer be this old before. Please, I doubt either of us will be getting much work done today. Not until we get an answer from Washington about the vote.
That's why I was so taken aback when I saw you. Forgive me, but I thought you and Mrs. Coles were going down to the telegraph office to wait for the news.
We were on our way when she decided it was best for me to return home. Waiting down there with everyone would be the last thing this old heart of mine needs, especially when there's no guarantee the amendment will pass.
I had no idea its passing meant that much to you, just like I had no idea you knew African proverbs. Don't beat the drums of war unless you're ready to fight. My son said something along those lines right before he enlisted.
Henry? Enlisted? You never mentioned that.
It's something I don't care to talk about, especially since, no, I won't say it,
Say what?
especially since none of it will make a difference.
Where's he stationed?
Petersburg, Virginia, serving under General Grant. They were both there when the president arrived last June.
Is that right?
Yes. Henry even got a chance to speak with him. Told him his mama was working as a maid up in Philadelphia for Mr. Edward Coles. After that, the president said, no, please forget I mentioned it. I was going to tell you this months ago, but it sounded so ridiculous in my head back then. And now that I'm saying it out loud, it sounds even more ridiculous.
What did the president say? If it really is as silly as you think, then we can both afford to have a good laugh.
The president said he knew you. He said he knew and admired an Edward Coles when he was governor of Illinois, and that this same Edward Coles had served the country under several presidents. See, I told you it was funny. Mr. Coles, I apologize if I offended you in any way.
Hester, I am not offended, and it's not funny to me because what the president said is true.
I beg your pardon? You're saying you know the President of the United States and that you've known other presidents as well? And that you were a governor of Illinois?
That is what I'm telling you. You can tell your Henry that he is fully vindicated when you write your next letter.
This is unbelievable. In all the time I've worked for you, you've never mentioned any of this.
Well, it never came up before. Just like Henry fighting under General Grant never came up before this morning either. Goes to show you, you can be in a person's company for a long period of time and not really know them.
Did you grow up in Illinois? Back when it was a territory?
It's not important now. What's past is past.
Well, I'd be interested to know. Really, I would.
Now, I didn't grow up in Illinois. I grew up in Virginia.
Which city?
Not a city. I grew up on a plantation. Like I said, what's past is past. And if you plan to work here, I'll sit in the parlor.
Why do you want it to pass then? How does someone who grew up on a plantation want an amendment like this to pass? How does someone born in a place like that go on to become so kind to someone like me? We both know neither of us is going to get any work done today. Not until we get the news out of Washington. While we wait, I was wondering if you could give me some answers. Yeah, I'm sure my son would like some answers too. As you said, you can be in a person's company for a long time and not really know them. I'd like to finally get to know you.
Where would you like me to begin?
The beginning's usually the best place, or so I've learned from all the books you've let me read.
Oh, very well then. I grew up in Enniscorthy, at the Enniscorthy plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia. There I was provided with the means to build a prosperous future, a future that became all too real to me in the fall of 1804. I was set to leave for the College of William and Mary, where I was expected to become either a man of service or a man of law. Above all, I was expected to become a man like my father. In all my years at Enniscorthy, never once did I question this plan. Little did I know it would be one of the many things I would go on to question in my years to come.
Edward, what you doing cooped up in here?
Morning, Papa. I was doing some reading.
My son, with his nose in a book. Why am I not surprised? Oh, notes on the state of Virginia. Why, this is Tom's book.
I read it once before, but given it's on the university's reading list, I reckon would be good to read it again. I tried reading downstairs, but I couldn't concentrate. You know how flustered Mama gets before company arrives?
Reading. Concentrating. Edward, son, you're going to be doing a lifetime's worth of that come this winter. Right now, you should be downstairs celebrating with the others. After all, it's not every day a young man sets off on a journey that will determine the rest of his life.
It's hard to believe. I won't be seeing that view when I wake up in the morning.
Oh, don't you worry. That view will always be waiting for you, as will the rest of Enniscorthy. We're up to 4,000 acres now, and I'm sure when you and your brother take over, it'll be even more. Why, between your brains and his brawn, the two of you will probably own half of Virginia by the time you're my age.
One day at a time, Papa. Things are happening fast enough as it is.
Life happens fast, son. That's why it's so important for you to seize onto opportunities when they present themselves. Now, how's about we head downstairs? I believe I saw your brother's carriage through the window on the way up.
I'm sure he'll have some new stories from the capital to tell us.
That, and a surprise guest or two, I imagine.
The parlor in Edward's Enniscorthy estate.
So I said to James, if you can pay Napoleon an additional $5 million for Louisiana, then you can pay the tailor an additional $5 for your wife's dress.
Oh, we were beginning to wonder when we'd see you.
Sorry, Mama. I'm afraid I lost track of the time.
Imagine those burned in another book. I imagine it must have been an extra thick encyclopedia. It'd have to be to conceal something as large as that nose of yours.
You would know all about large noses, wouldn't you, Isaac? Where do you think I got mine from?
Oh, I can't tell you how good it is to see you, Ed.
Good to see you, too. It seems Capital Life continues to agree with you.
As you can see, your brother brought your cousin along.
Oh, hello, Edward. I know I expressed my congratulations on your acceptance in my last letter, but I wanted to do it in person as well. James wouldn't have been here, but he had a prior commitment.
I understand, Ollie. I know he's a busy man these days.
Let me tell you something, Ed. Everyone I've run into says we've never had a Secretary of State quite like our cousin's husband. I know she doesn't like talking about it, but people are hoping he'll consider running for president one day.
Oh, no, stop, Isaac. Can you imagine me living in that house for 4, possibly 8 years? It's so drab. I'd feel like a parrot trapped in a cage.
Well, the president's house isn't that dreary, Dolly. All it needs is a good library.
Tom, welcome.
We hope the journey out here wasn't too much for you.
I'm used to long trips by now, Rebecca, as I'm sure your eldest son has told you. So good to see everyone. Especially our boy of the hour. Or should I say our man of the hour. Congratulations on your acceptance, Edward.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Wait. Thomas? Mr. President? Are you talking about Thomas Jefferson? The Thomas Jefferson?
He was a neighbor and family friend for years. He appointed James Madison as his Secretary of State, and he appointed my brother Isaac as his private secretary.
Well, if James Madison was his Secretary of State, that means your cousin was Dolly Madison?
Indeed. After she lost most of her family to the yellow fever epidemic in 1793, Dolly met and married James Madison while he was in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Well, I'll be. Any other notable relatives or family friends?
Well, James Monroe owned the plantation next to ours, but I digress.
You have no idea how hard your father and I worked to keep Tom's visit a secret, Edward. But we were certain it would get spoiled for you, especially with your brother coming.
No, I wouldn't have worried about that, Rebecca. Isaac has already proven he's quite capable of keeping his fair share of secrets. Isn't that right, Isaac?
What? Mr. President,
I'm only joking. After all, this is a party. We are permitted to joke and have fun. Unless we identify as Federalists, of course.
I tell you, the last thing this country needs is another Federalist, especially with this whole business going down between Britain and France.
It is quite frightening. That little Napoleon fellow is causing quite the commotion, isn't he?
What are your thoughts, Mr. President? Do you think we'll get dragged into another war anytime soon?
No, I don't believe so. Especially when men like your brother are striving to become our future leaders. I would advise you to stop focusing on any prospects of impending war and instead focus on your upcoming studies. This ring will help you.
What's this?
This ring was given to me while I was a student at William & Mary. I wore it for every exam I took, and I wore it whilst I was writing the Declaration.
You're giving this to me?
I am. There's an inscription on it that I've always found particularly inspiring. I'm hoping it'll bring you as much luck in your life as it has brought me.
I see the inscription. I'll treasure it always, sir. Thank you, Mr. President.
Why don't we all sit down? Drinks should be coming out in a moment, if anyone cares for one.
Oh, I have been caring for one since I got here. I'm sure the men would agree with me.
Oh, no argument from me, Dolly. You never told us you were wearing that ring when you wrote the Declaration. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Edward memorized the entire thing by heart.
Is that so?
Well, not all of it.
Still, I'd like to hear it.
go ahead, Ed. Let's see what those reading and memorization skills of yours are made of.
Very well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just.
Oh, look at this, you worthless imbecile!
I'm sorry, Mr. Isaac.
Isaac, it's not worth your help. Stop.
The drink slipped and I pleased myself. I would never.
We will address this later, Ralph.
Elizabeth, fetch my son another drink, will you?
Yes, Mrs. Rebecca.
I'm glad I wasn't on the receiving end of that. Had you been on the front line during the Revolution, Isaac, we would have beaten the British in half the time.
Well, if you thought that was bad, you should have seen him when he crossed the paths with Roger Nelson from Maryland the other day.
Forgive me, Ed. The last thing I wanted was for my temper to ruin your big day. I reckon I get angrier than usual when certain people don't know their proper place.
It will learn its proper place before the day is done.
Exactly how many Ralphs do you own now, John?
84. I started out with 9.
You know, sometimes I feel as if Enniscorthy is expanding more rapidly than the country.
Well, between the tobacco, hemp, cotton, and wheat, well, this place has no choice but to expand. All right. In all departments.
Now, I believe that Edward was in the middle of reciting the Declaration.
Ed? President Jefferson is talking to you.
I'm sorry. I'm afraid I lost my place.
Not to worry. It was an impressive feat, nonetheless. I propose a toast to Edward Coles. May he make us proud in all his studies and future endeavors.
To Edward.
To Edward.
And may he live a life worthy enough to go down in history.
We study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward Coles.
That night, Mama had all my favorite food prepared to perfection. And yet, whenever the food touched my lips, I felt as if it would spoil. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I think it was because of Ralph.
Ralph, the slave who spilt the drink on your brother?
Yes. Right before Papa took him outside, I caught sight of his eyes. What I saw in them deeply troubled me.
What did you see?
Fear. Fear like of the likes of which I'd taken the time to notice before. Then as Mama and I said our goodbyes to President Jefferson, Isaac, and Dolly, I heard the sound coming from the nearest barn. It was a crack of a whip. The next morning, I said goodbye to my parents.
Remember, it's important that you engage in proper socialization with your peers outside the classroom.
You can start with John Tyler. His mother told me he had developed some rather grand political aspirations since you last saw him. It would be nice for you to reconnect.
I will look for him, Mama.
Oh, Edward, now's not the time for tears. There will be plenty of those once your carriage departs.
Goodbye, Papa. Goodbye, Mama.
Goodbye, Mr. Edward.
Goodbye, Elizabeth. Goodbye, Ralph.
Now, be sure to make excuse me. Be sure to make us proud. As I said before, what I own today you'll own tomorrow.
Are you telling me you were bothered by what you saw that morning?
Is that so hard to believe?
Frankly, yes, it is. Mr. Coles, you earlier said your father owned 84 slaves. That's 84 human beings subjected to lives of torment. Growing up, you must have seen violence committed against them dozens, if not hundreds of times. And then one morning, it suddenly bothers you? Explain.
Well, perhaps it had been my recital of the Declaration the night prior, whilst in the company of my father's slaves. Or maybe it had been all the talks concerning my upcoming inheritance. Or most importantly of all, might have been my realization that up until that morning, life at Enniscorthy had been the only life I had ever known. It had been a life of masters and slaves, a life where the only truths that existed were the ones contained within the plantation borders. All I knew when I departed that day was that my time at school had the potential to be a time of reckoning. And by that time I returned, I might very well be an entirely different person than when I left. At university, the most influential course I took was one in moral philosophy. In this course, the instructor championed the idea of American independence, an idea had seemed to be forgotten in light of the country's rapid expansion. It was through the course that I was introduced to the writings of some of the greatest free thinkers who had ever lived.
Count Constantine, Jean de Volney, Thomas Paine, Thomas Reed, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
These men explored the horrors of slavery and emphasized that liberty and equality could not truly exist in a country where slavery was allowed to flourish. The more I read, the more I realized the freedom I had enjoying in my entire life was due in part to others losing their freedom. The more I read, the more I realized my family's lifestyle went against everything this country was supposed to stand for.
Man was born free, and he is everywhere in chains. Those who think themselves the masters of others are indeed greater slaves than they.
That's a quote from The Social Contract, isn't it?
It is.
Henry took that book with him when he enlisted. I'm trying to think of the line he quoted in his latest letter. In respect of riches, no citizen shall ever be wealthy enough to buy another,
and none poor enough to be forced to sell himself.
Did you write your family during this time? I highly doubt if they approved of your discoveries.
I wrote whenever I could, but ultimately I decided to keep my discoveries to myself. That was until I received some unfortunate news and was called back to Enniscorthy. Papa, who had been in poor health for months, had deteriorated to the point where my family needed assistance with the upcoming harvest. Given Isaac was unavailable due to his commitments to the newly elected president, I had no choice but to leave university for a few weeks before my final exams were set to begin. The trip back home marked the definitive end of my college education. I helped my family throughout that summer and the following fall. Then one February day, Papa took a turn for the worse, and the moment I had been dreading was finally upon me.
The master bedroom and parlor at the Enniscorthy estate.
Oh, Papa, I always knew this day would come, but I never thought it would come about like this. I always thought it would have happened after been given time to think, time to plan, time to decide.
What is there to decide, Edward? From the moment you were born, you've always had wisdom beyond your years. You're ready. You're ready to go forth and do all the great things your mama and I know that you're capable of.
What great things!
That's for you to discover. You can begin by following this and getting yourself situated at Rockfish Farm. You remember that place, don't you? I bought it from Francis Merriweather.
It's a plantation?
782 acres, located 20 miles southwest of here. I know you'll do it proud, just as I know Isaac will do Enniscorthy proud.
Will I have slaves?
19, including Ralph and Elizabeth.
Papa, please, I can't lose you.
You won't fall. I will always be with you.
I love you, Papa.
I love you too, son. Remember what I told you. Seize on the opportunities when they present themselves. Make me proud.
I brought you some coffee, Mr. Edward. I'll bring another cup for Mr. Isaac when he arrives.
Thank you, Ralph.
I'm so sorry. If it's any comfort, you being here the past few months really made a difference. It was the happiest I've seen your father since you was little, and you would read to him in the study.
I'm surprised you remember that.
I used to listen while I did work, and then I'd tell Elizabeth all the stories I heard. My favorite was the one where Sisyphus pushed that rock up the hill.
That was my favorite too. To think, all these years living here, and I never knew that about you.
It just goes to show you can be in a person's company for a long period of time and not really know them. Enjoy the coffee.
Ralph, wait. Ralph, would you sit with me?
Sit with you?
Yes. Please. As I'm sure you're aware, I've inherited a great deal from Papa, including a plantation. This makes me your new
Massa.
As such, I was hoping we could talk about you.
Talk about me? What you want to talk about?
For starters, Ralph, your real name. I did a lot of reading about slaves while I was away. I read many of them were given new names, English, English names when they got here?
No, sir. I've been Ralph Crawford my whole life.
Oh, okay. Were you brought over on a ship?
Nah, I was born south from here. When my mama died, I was sold. Master John bought me around the time that you were born.
You were born into this? So this is all you've ever known?
Yes. What else would I have known?
Ralph, what you doing? You can't be sitting there. Mrs. Rebecca told us we cannot
It's fine,
be sitting there.
Elizabeth. I asked him to. We've been talking.
Mr. Edward asked if my real name was Ralph, which it is. And he asked if I was brought over on a ship, which I wasn't. Let's get going now. We should be getting back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth?
Elizabeth.
If I may ask, Mr. Edward, why did you ask Ralph all them questions?
Since I've inherited you from my father, I wanted to get to know you better.
Get to know us better?
Where you come from. If the names I've been calling you all these years are the same names your parents gave you at birth, I'm genuinely curious.
Elizabeth, if we fall behind.
Ekwa. That was the name my father gave me. He named me that because it meant to convert pain to happiness. He said I helped convert his pain to happiness after my mother died. It was the only name I knew before I came here.
Were you brought here with him?
He was in debt, so we was traded to the white man who came. Once they came, they put us on the ship.
Elizabeth, if Mrs. Rebecca comes in here and...
I will talk with Mama, and if there's a problem, Ralph, if there's a problem, I'll talk with Mama. Elizabeth, what happened when they put you on the ship?
Our heads were shaved and our clothes was ripped off our backs. I started crying because my father was wearing a shirt my mother had made. From there, we was brought below deck with hundreds of others. The men was kept on one side of the ship and the women on the other. Since I was a child, I was allowed to go to the other side and see my father. The ceiling was so low, I would sometimes bump my head in the darkness. Whenever I got there, my father would do his best to hug me so the shackles wouldn't scrape my face. He'd hug me as the other men would cry, and he would hug me while human waste splashed on the floor around us. Then he'd tell me stories, the same stories he used to tell me back home. As he told them, I tilt my head back and imagine the wooden ceiling rocking above was the sky. The sky I used to see when I looked out my window at night.
Did they ever take you above deck?
For a few hours of each day, but I wish they hadn't. Whenever we was above deck, that was when they would force my father and all the other men to sing and dance. My father, whose pride never once let me see him cry back at our village, had to dance like an animal so the crew could laugh. A week before we arrived, my father got ill. The man who used to carry me with ease on his shoulders had gotten so sick he could barely stand. He got so bad, the rice and beans we was given had to be forced down his throat. One day, when we was above deck and my father was forced to dance, 2 members of the crew carried him over to the side of the ship. There they looked at me, smiled with grins as wide as the ship's bow. and threw him overboard. By the time I got to the side and looked down into the water, my father had already sunk, leaving bubbles in the ocean behind him. I didn't talk the rest of the voyage. The first words I spoke after that was when I was bought at auction. My new master asked me what my name was. I said, Ekwa. He laughed and said Ekwa was a nigger name and that my new name was Elizabeth. That's been my name since.
Ralph, Elizabeth, why weren't you two available to greet my son at the door?
It's my fault, Mama. I asked him to stay.
I had no idea you two were so sociable. Very well then. What was that all about?
They were answering some questions I had. Things are a lot clearer now. I'm so glad you're here. I was telling Mama this morning how kind it was for President Madison to excuse you from your duties. I can only imagine how hectic it must be presently for the administration, especially given the situation with the British.
James has always been a compassionate man, Ed. When he found out the news about Papa, he told me to take as much time as I needed.
Isaac.
He did say that, Mama. Right before he forced me to resign.
You were fired?
Not fired. Forced to resign. There's a difference.
I'd certainly love to hear what the difference is.
Why did the president, the same president who's married to our cousin, fire you, excuse me, force you to resign?
It's complicated. Do you remember Roger Nelson?
The representative from Maryland, the one Mr. Jefferson said you were always arguing with?
Yes, well, I got into another argument with them a week or two ago, and I may have lost control of my emotions.
Your brother beat him up.
I defended my honor.
By beating up a United States representative? Dolly told me all about it in her letter. Your father's barely in the ground and you've already disgraced his name. It's so humiliating.
I didn't disgrace anything. Washington City disgraced me. The place is so full of snakes and rats, it should have been built on the Louisiana swamp.
Tom will be paying us a visit later this evening to see how we are coping. I suggest you listen to what he tells you. If anyone can clean up this mess and restore some dignity to the COLES family name, it's Thomas Jefferson.
I don't care to see him. I don't care to see anyone associated with that godforsaken city ever again. Besides, aren't I to be managing this place now, Mama? I can't very well do that if I'm in the nation's capital.
As we've discussed before, you do not assume complete control of your inheritance until I pass away.
But aren't you going to need help? I can't give you proper help if I'm serving as errand boy to another president. I'll be running the most prosperous plantation in all of Virginia. Well, unless Ed manages to build up Rockfish Farm. Say, Ed, I was pondering this on the carriage ride over. Would you consider trading me Ralph and Elizabeth? I can give you a generous sum plus 4 additional laborers.
Why? Why do you want them?
They're better suited to serve me here at Enniscorthy than at your farm. Don't you think? Besides, they're more scared of me than they are of you. All I'd have to do is crack a whip and they'd be cleaning the crumbs out of my feet.
No. No, I reject your offer.
Ah, So that's how it's going to be then, is it? Are the professors at William and Mary teaching students new negotiation tactics?
Edward, please don't be difficult. On what reason would you have to reject your brother's generous offer?
I reject the offer because I intend to free Ralph and Elizabeth and all the other slaves I've inherited.
Must be teaching comedy as well. Woo!
It was a clever joke, sweetheart, but we all needed a laugh. I am sorry I confronted you earlier.
If it leads to jokes like that from Ed, feel free to confront me as often as you'd like.
Edward. Honey, what's wrong?
It wasn't a joke.
I don't think either me or please explain, Edward. But we were very confused.
My stance is quite simple. I have no intention of becoming a slave owner. Not now or ever. Not now nor ever. Mama, I wanted to tell you in a letter, but by the time I was ready to write it, Papa fell ill and I...
So you're being serious? Not only do you refuse your slaves, but you intend on freeing them?
That's correct. I fully intend on releasing every person I've inherited.
And how do you intend on maintaining a plantation without slaves, huh? If you remember, Dolly's father liberated all of his slaves, and it hurt his position economically.
More like destroyed his position economically. Why, if Dolly hadn't met James and married him when she did?
There are other ways to earn a living, a decent living, without taking away the freedom of another human being. In terms of running a plantation, I honestly don't care. I apologize for being this blunt, but I don't. While I've loved my life here, my prospects lie elsewhere.
You hear that, Mama? He doesn't care. He doesn't care about what Grandpa built and Papa sweat over, you son of a bitch!
Okay, Ralph! Elizabeth, get in here!
You attend a few enlightened lectures and read a couple of books, and you're ready to destroy everything this family has worked for!
Ralph, Elizabeth, prepare for a warm bath for Isaac, okay? My eldest son is quite tired from his journey and needs some rest.
Yes, Mrs. Rebecca. Would you like something, Massa? Massa Edward?
Are you sure you don't want... I'm sorry, allow me a moment.
That'll be enough, Isaac. Give us a moment.
And you accused me of disgracing the name of COLES.
Mama, please. If you let me explain my position further.
What is this, Edward? A congressional debate? I expect this spur-of-the-moment behavior from Isaac, not from you.
I assure you, there's nothing spur of the moment about it. I've been contemplating this for a while now.
Well, perhaps, given the circumstances, you should contemplate it further. Not a word of this to Ralph, Elizabeth, or the rest of them, okay? If they learn you want to free them, there will be an uprising. This family has lost enough already.
This whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other.
Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. From his cradle to his grave, he's learning to do what he sees others do.
Mr. Jefferson, I'm so sorry I didn't see you there.
Hello, Edward. How did I do with quoting myself?
Right on every word.
I should hope so. I've spent so long writing that damn passage, I wouldn't be so concerned if I didn't have it memorized by now.
Mama said you would be stopping by. When did you get here?
About half an hour ago. Isaac and I were talking. Seems you all had quite an eventful afternoon.
That's putting it lightly.
Don't dwell on it. We all say things we don't mean when we quarrel, especially when that quarrel is in the wake of a death. I remember how I quarreled with others when my Martha died. I was so angry at the world, angry at God.
Papa always said death had the capacity to bring out both the best and the worst in all of us.
Wise man, your father. He'll be missed more than words can describe.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Mr. President.
Our current president sends his sympathies as well.
I know. We received such a beautiful letter from him and Dolly. I'm still trying to comprehend. My cousin is the First Lady of the United States.
Speaking of the Madisons, they're part of the reason for my visit this evening. As I'm sure you know, the three of us have maintained a close correspondence. And lately, in all of our conversations, a certain member of the COLES family has been brought up quite frequently.
I can imagine. Makes me wonder how Papa would have reacted if he had been here to find out what happened with Isaac.
I'm not talking about Isaac. I'm talking about you, Edward. You're the COLES we keep discussing. Perhaps this letter will clarify the matter.
Dear Edward, I am writing to request that you fill the vacancy as my private secretary. In these times of uncertainty, I need people I can trust. My wife and my dear friend, Thomas Jefferson, have personally vouched for your loyalty and have assured me no one would be able to fulfill the position better than you. Please respond promptly. Signed, President James Madison. Me? As private secretary to the President of the United States?
Did I not say you were bound for great things when I toasted to your college education? Why, this position is...
one I cannot accept.
I beg your pardon?
I cannot live in Washington City, not at a time like this.
May I ask why not?
You know what transpired this afternoon. You know what I committed myself to.
So you were, in fact, serious about liberating your property.
They're not property, Mr. President.
Call me Tom. After all these years of friendship, it's more than appropriate for us to be on a first-name basis.
Very well then. I'm not sure what Isaac told you, Tom, but I have every intention of fulfilling all the promises I've made, including the ones regarding my inheritance.
I see.
You act as if no one has ever spoken out against this sort of thing before. Think of the line in your declaration. All men are created equal. Are the individuals I inherited from my papa not men? Why? In Notes on the State of Virginia, you described slavery as a great political and moral evil.
I did. I also called for an eventual eradication of slavery. An eventual eradication, not an immediate one.
Well, how long does an eventual eradication pertain to? A year? A decade? How long must we wait for progress?
However long we need to. Think of revolutions. If I'm not mistaken, the authors you studied at university viewed revolutions as natural parts of progress, correct?
That's correct.
Well, revolutions take time. They take planning. After all, the fight for our nation's independence didn't take place after a handful of debates. If it had, then you and I wouldn't be talking like this right now. The same goes for slavery. Why, if every man decided to free his slaves at the same moment, the very foundation of this country would fall apart like a house of cards.
But I am not every man. I am my own person with the freedom to make my own decisions.
And tell me, Edward, is this the right time for you to make this decision? Your father, God rest his soul, is gone. He's gone, and he left you with a substantial piece of land that will require forced labor to maintain.
I told Mama and Isaac that I have no interest in being a plantation owner.
Very well. Have you found a suitable buyer to purchase your plantation?
No, not yet.
So you refuse to maintain it, and you have no interest. You have no interest in buyers. Well, what's the plan then? Let the land your father gave you rot and go to waste?
I haven't thought through all the specifics. All I know is I must do this. When in the course of history, has it ever been the wrong time to do the right thing?
When it winds up costing you everything you've ever worked for, say you ignore my warnings and proceed with this action. How exactly do you intend on assisting all these men, women, and children once you free them without a stable career? Virginia law requires that all emancipated slaves leave the state within 1 year or risk re-enslavement. Where will they go once you free them? Do you think that they have a means to travel to a northern state or head to one of the territories by themselves? Do you think that they can blend into our society and assimilate without your assistance? Now, if you are committed to doing this, then be smart about it. Commit to it with logic, not emotions, because as of now, you're dangling a carrot before a pony, and that pony is about to lead you off a cliff. President Madison requests your response by the end of the month. I assured him we would get a response much sooner. Perhaps it was wishful thinking on my part, or perhaps it was my desire to see the Coles family name restored.
You knew he was right, didn't you? Surely you realized you hadn't the means to follow through on your promises.
Oh, I knew it. It just took me a while to admit it to myself. By the end of the month, I left for Washington City and bid farewell to my family again. Mom and I corresponded regularly through letters. She provided me with details on Enniscorthy, and I in turn provided her with details on all that was transpiring within the nation's capital.
I imagine you had loads to tell her. I was only a little girl at the time, but I vividly remember relations deteriorating quickly with the British.
There was a great deal of worry throughout the country and the president's handling of the situation was frequently criticized by all sides. But as soon as I learned the greater challenge, the greater the drive to face it, my service in Washington City granted me the opportunity to mingle and socialize with all sides of the political elite. Through it all, Dolly and her husband, President James Madison, were right there beside me, giving me the skills and knowledge I would one day utilize for my own benefit.
The office of the president.
I tell you, Dolly, out of all the dinners you've hosted, tonight's was your finest yet.
Oh, Edward, do you know how many times you've said that to me in all the time you've been here?
Hey, don't blame me that you continue to outdo yourself. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. President?
Oh, you don't need to convince me. Who'd have thought, though the key to countering any contentious political issues was to have one's wife host a series of dinner parties.
Well, it is not as simple as it looks, darling. Take that one representative I was talking to. He kept asking me all those questions about the Illinois territory. I thought he was going to talk my ear off until I showed him that portrait of George Washington.
That portrait has a way of silencing the most talkative among us, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say your socialization skills are beginning to rub off on our Edward here. Did you see him talking with the representative's daughters?
I did. Although whenever Edward talks to a pair of beautiful women, I doubt he's thinking about diplomacy.
Well, he needs to be thinking about diplomacy when he hosts that party aboard the USS Constellation. Sorry, I remember the Constitution so good. Anyway, Republicans and Federalists at the same location, and people are worried the British will bring war to this city.
I promise I'll make you proud, Mr. President.
I know you will, as does the First Lady. Oh, you look tired, sweetheart. Perhaps you should retire.
I think I will. Besides, I'm hosting a drawing room party in the morning.
I'll have your things prepared.
Good night, darling. And good night, Edward.
Not Dolly.
Edward, wait. I was hoping to have a word with you. Firstly, I wanted to thank you for all the wonderful work you've been doing. My advisors tell me our efforts to restore confidence in this administration are working. Why, there's even talk that if we continue to win over the representatives, the military appropriation bill may be approved by Congress.
That's wonderful news. I wish I could take all the credit, but I wouldn't have known where to begin without Dolly.
Oh, she's become quite the asset, hasn't she? Reminds me of my mother in many ways. Growing up, my father would always tell me, boys will eventually marry their mothers. Well, I can see now he was right.
I'm happy to assist her in any way I can. And I'm happy to assist you too, of course.
Well, speaking of which, I was wondering if you...
Oh, sorry for the wait, Mr. President. You rang for me.
Yes, Paul. The First Lady is retiring. See that the others attend to her needs as she readies herself for bed.
Yes, sir. Evening, Mr. Edward.
Now, as I was saying, would you ever consider traveling abroad if the situation called for it?
In what context, sir? Are you referring to the war?
I'm referring to when the dust from this war settles. Given the way you've helped instill confidence in this administration amongst, well, political parties in Washington, I was wondering if you would be willing to do the same for our allies overseas.
Sir, to be able to travel the world and serve this office at the same time, I I would be most honored.
Oh, I knew you would agree. Well, that'll be all. Unless there's something else you wish to discuss.
No, Mr. President.
Your mannerisms say otherwise.
I'm sure Mr. Jefferson informed you of what transpired between me and my family before I accepted this position.
Yes, he did. I know we haven't discussed the matter, but I wanted you to know that I thoroughly agree with you.
You do?
I never sought to become a slave owner. Like you, I inherited my slaves from my father. I've always found the concept of one human owning another abhorrent. Oh, how I wish there were clear solutions to this country's problems.
You don't think there's a clear solution to slavery?
Have you ever heard of a country freeing its slaves at the beginning of war? Why, if all the slaves were freed tonight, the British would have thousands of new troops at their disposal by dawn.
You think the slaves would join the British?
Now, if you were brought over here in chains, sold at auction, and stripped of your humanity, whose side would you join? Your master's? Or those willing to fight your master? Oh. This war may very well be our second fight for independence. As President Washington so eloquently said, to be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving peace. Come on now. I'll escort you out.
What do you think we will wind up calling this war, sir? That is, if it continues to escalate?
I don't know. You have any suggestions?
The War of 1812, perhaps?
Oh, Edward, that's a terrible name for it.
I know, sir. Hopefully historians will be able to think of a better name one day.
One hope.
We study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward Coles. He remains seated with Esther.
Dolly saved that portrait of George Washington when the British burned up President's house, didn't she?
While she did give the order for it to be saved, it was ultimately her slave, Paul Jennings, who rescued it.
I didn't know that.
Few people do. Luckily, President Madison was in the Maryland countryside when the British attacked the capital.
You were close with him, weren't you?
Not very much so. If it hadn't been for him, I would have only seen the world as it had been at Enniscorthy. I often thought about home and about the plantation I had inherited, but with no prospective buyers and no opportunity to take my slaves out of Virginia, I had very few options. And that's when I realized that if I couldn't free my slaves, maybe men far more revered than me could set an example for others to follow.
Well, these look like letters. Letters addressed to Thomas Jefferson.
Correct. With President Madison occupied with the War of 1812, I turned my efforts to Tom. You'll see my original drafts there, as well as his responses.
July 31st, 1814. Dear Sir, I never took up my pen with more hesitation or felt more embarrassment than I do now in addressing you on the subject of this letter.
My object is to entreat and beseech you to exert your knowledge and influence in devising and getting into operation some plan for the gradual emancipation of slavery. Only the father of freedom and equality could mobilize the support required to put into complete practice those hallowed principles contained in that renowned declaration in which you were the immortal author.
I shall gladly avail myself to assure you of the very great respect and esteem with which I am, my dear sir, your very sincere and devoted friend, Edward Coles. August 25th, 1814. Dear Sir, your favor of July 31st was duly received and was read with peculiar pleasure. I had always hoped that the younger generation would have sympathized with oppression wherever found and proved their love of liberty beyond their own share of it. This enterprise is for the young, for those who can follow it up and bear it through to its consummation. It shall have all my prayers, and these are the only weapons of an old man. But in the meantime, are you right in abandoning this property and your country with it? I think not. Until more can be done for them, we should endeavor, with those whom fortune has thrown on our hands, to feed and clothe them well, protect them from ill usage, require some reasonable labor only as it is performed voluntarily by freemen, and be led by no repugnancies to abdicate them and our duties to them. The laws do not permit us to turn them loose, if that were for their good.
I hope that your success may be as speedy and complete as it will be of honorable and immortal consolation to yourself. I shall as fervently and sincerely pray as I assure you of my great friendship and respect, Thomas Jefferson.
I wrote no more letters to Tom on the matter.
You rang for me?
Yes. Please ensure that this is placed with the rest of the items I'll be taking into town today.
Oh, is this the letter addressed to Mr. Edward? Why, all of us here has been talking about him. Even the children asked about the promises he made before he left.
If Edward Coles had been serious about any of the promises he had made, he'd have followed through with them by now. And you shouldn't be discussing anything with anyone at Monticello that doesn't pertain to work.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
I'll see you when I return. Won't I, Sally?
Yes, Master.
I wrote no more letters to Tom on the matter, but I did think of him often. Shortly after our correspondence, I was sent overseas to resolve a diplomatic incident in Russia. There I learned the unfortunate truth regarding the presence of slavery around the world.
Vassals. That's what they call the slaves in Russia.
Correct. Although slavery was present there, I was astonished to learn that the vassals could own property and would only spend a portion of their time cultivating crops. My time overseas made me realize the men and women I had inherited would never be truly free until they attained their own property and their own level of independence. After returning home, I finally found a buyer for Rockfish Farm, and then I began searching for land in a free territory that would not only accommodate my needs, but the needs of the men and women I had inherited as well.
Illinois?
It was applying for statehood at the time, and much to my delight, its delegates wished to prohibit slavery. Furthermore, the position of the Register of Lands at Edwardsville has become vacant. And remembering Papa's advice about seizing opportunities as soon as they presented themselves, I scheduled a meeting with President Madison's successor and an old friend of my family, James Monroe.
Forgive me, Edward, if I seem a little surprised. When you asked to meet with me, I assumed you had reconsidered my request to serve as my private secretary.
No, sir. Although I was greatly honored by the offer.
You were greatly honored, as opposed to honored. Can you specify the difference?
Well,
Edward, I'm joking, for Land's sake, son. What happened to the mischievous boy I knew from Enniscorthy?
I'm afraid he grew up.
Oh, that's what everyone tells me, including former President Madison. Like me, he was disappointed that you didn't continue serving as private secretary. He was also disappointed you sold Rockfish Farm. I must say, I agree with him. He also said I would be foolish to ignore any of your requests. As our friends in the press have stated, this is an era of good feelings. The war is over, and optimism in this country's future is now at new heights. With that said, I can think of no better person to serve as Register of Lands in Edwardsboro. Consider the position yours, my friend.
Mr. President, I don't know what to say.
You can start by forming coherent words and sentences. That's a mandatory requirement for the position.
I promise I'll be able to do that.
If the territory does become a state, perhaps you'll consider pursuing a higher office out there.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, Mr. President.
Oh, is any man truly sure of himself when he sets out to become a leader? Neither I, nor James Madison, nor Thomas Jefferson were when we decided to lead this country.
In all the years I've known James and Tom, neither of them ever told me that.
It isn't a step for the faint of heart. But if you can take that step, the rewards can be great. Not just for yourself, but for others as well.
I never thought of it that way.
Oh, there is a price on liberty, and that is our willingness to assume the responsibilities of free men. Payment of this price is a personal matter with each of us. I can have one of the slaves escort you out.
That won't be necessary, sir. I can manage.
When you depart for Illinois, might I suggest you travel by river? I hear the rivers leading to the territory are quite beautiful this time of year, as is the accompanying scenery.
I'll be certain to remember that suggestion, Mr. President. I'll be certain to remember.
Brilliant. Good.
A flatboat floating on the Ohio River.
Ain't the weather nice out here, Elizabeth? The Ohio River's been much easier on this flatboat than the Monongahela River was. That's for sure.
They're the same to me.
Nah, they're not. Master Edwards said that Monongahela was north of Pittsburgh. Ohio River stretches west to Illinois.
I'm not talking about the rivers, Ralph. I'm talking about the water. It all looks the same to me. Don't beat the drums of war unless you're ready to fight.
What's that?
the morning my father was killed, I told him if he didn't want to dance for the men, he should fight them. He said, given how sick he was, he couldn't. And then he said that proverb to me. I had no idea what it meant at the time, but having lived this life for so long, I'm finally starting to understand. Illinois is going to be worse than Virginia.
How so?
In Virginia, Massa Edward has a home. In Illinois, we'll have to build that home for him from the ground up. The more I think about it, the more I hear those drums in my head, and the more I wonder if I could do what my father couldn't.
Ralph, Elizabeth, how are you?
Rest of my arm. I'll start rolling again in another minute.
Make it a couple more miles, Ralph. You've earned yourself a proper rest. I was just telling the others, you're part of the reason why we're so ahead of schedule. And what about you, Elizabeth? Are you enjoying Ralph's company while he rests?
I am. We was only talking.
I realized I never got the chance to ask you two how you two managed on the wagon ride to Brownsville.
We managed fine. We were surprised you let us ride ahead without you.
Do you know why I did it? To give you a little taste of what's waiting in Illinois.
Huh?
I've been wanting to announce this to everyone for a while now, but I wanted the two of you to know it first.
Okay. Yes?
I'm emancipating you. I'm emancipating you and your companions. Each of you will receive a portion of land once we reach our destination as free men and women. As of now, you're all free. Now, as I said earlier, I haven't told the others yet. Ralph, my friend, would you be so kind as to do it for me?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I still don't understand. What do you mean by free?
Free as this country's Declaration of Independence intended. Free as God himself intended. Free as your beloved father intended.
Free. Oh, Master Edward!
Let me make one thing clear. You are never to call me that again. From now on, my name to you is Edward. Just Edward. And rest assured, having already beat this drum, I plan on continuing to fight for you. For Ralph. For everyone else. Because this is a fight. A fight for your freedom, your happiness, and your identity.
I don't have the words. Thank you, Edward. Thank you.
No. Thank you, Equa.
He freed us. Did you hear? That's what calls. It's freed us.
The study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward Coles.
The study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward COLES.
I'm still trying to comprehend everything you've told me. Exchanging letters with Thomas Jefferson, going overseas on behalf of James Madison, becoming register of the land office in Illinois thanks to James Monroe.
You certainly have your fair share of material to tell Henry in your next letter.
I just hope it's enough to provide him with some much needed distractions. The things he's seen those goddamn Confederates do on the battlefields, let's just say it's enough to keep any parent up at night.
I'm sorry about that. I was looking at it earlier and forgot I left it out.
Newspaper article about one of your exploits?
No, this is a newspaper article about something else. Anyway, it's not relevant to where we left off.
Ah, yes, your arrival in Illinois. I imagine it must have been quite the sight when you all arrived in Edwardsville. 19 black travelers walking by your side. You must have turned your fair share of heads.
Saying we did was an understatement. However, we soon discovered the shadow of slavery had followed us on our journey. Throughout the state, there was a great debate as to whether slavery should be permitted. What's more, many residents defended an indentured servitude system that was just as barbaric as the system we had fled from.
But your father's slaves were freed, weren't they? You did free them, correct?
I did, and I hired them to work for me in our new home.
Oh.
But for some, I hadn't freed them soon enough. The fall of 1819 brought us hardships, but no hardship hit us harder than the one of the most prominent members in our company fell gravely ill.
You go on and tell Emmanuel he'll be in charge of the Eastern Fields. You tell Logan.
No, I'll do no such thing because I am not leaving your side. Ralph, I should have freed you when you still had a life to live.
Edward, because of you, there were folks here named Ralph Crawford. They won't think of the slave born in Virginia. They'll think of the free man who died here in Illinois.
I wish this place truly was free. Each day, I find it becoming more and more like one of the slave states.
That's why you gotta keep fighting. Just like the proverb says at Equatotus. Illinois will be electing a new governor soon. I love nothing more than to look down from the heaven and see a Governor Edward COLES.
Governor COLES, I'm afraid that fever is making you delusional, my friend. My dear friend.
If Ralph is delusional, then so am I. The day you left for school, I told him you'd be a governor someday, maybe even a president.
True, Edward. She did say that.
I'm not questioning whether she did or didn't. I'm questioning how. How am I supposed to run for office here of all places? Me?
You'll find a way to beat the drum. And when you do, I'll be listening. I'll be listening just like I used to listen to all those stories you read. This is your story now. Now I have a feeling it'll be the best story yet.
My fellow Illinoisans, as your current Chief Justice on the state Supreme Court, I am appalled by what I see. Our state has only been a part of the Union for a short time, and already we have our fair share of problems. As the 21st and newest state, we are without a stable currency, and yet our residents are forced to compete for wages and land with the Negro. Within the past 2 years, the Negro population has increased a remarkable 59% and is predicted to increase at a percentage higher than any other state in the Northwest. The people of Illinois cannot and will not support such alarming statistics. As we have seen in our sister state of Missouri, those who have wished to turn newer states into free states create nothing but division and turmoil. Having hailed from Tennessee, where bound labor succeeds in keeping the Negro under control, I pride myself as someone who can lead us into a prosperous future. That's why I ask those of you who support the fine institution of slavery to support me, Joseph B. Phillips, in my campaign for governor. Together, we, the superior citizens for whom this country was built, will save not only this state, but ourselves. Thank you.
Woo!
Yes!
Yeah.
Tell it.
Oh!
My fellow Illinoisans, although I have only lived in this state a short while, I too am appalled by what I see occurring. As Register of the Lands Office in Edwardsville under President James Monroe, I have seen the hopes and prospects of landowners grow grimmer by the day. Having served as private secretary under President James Madison, I have seen people throughout Europe and Russia living their lives with economic stability and confidence. The fact that the same cannot be said for nearly 1/4 of the people of Illinois is unacceptable to me. My experiences abroad confirmed my belief that the institution of slavery is a repugnant evil which must not be allowed to seep through our borders. As the son of a Virginia plantation owner, I saw the horrors of slavery firsthand. And as your future governor, I cannot and will not allow the same to happen here. Make no mistake, slavery is one of the most important issues in this election. And unlike my opponents, who have either embraced the institution or remained silent, I can assure you, I am the true anti-slavery candidate. Shortly before my arrival in Edwardsville, I emancipated all my slaves. And I implore those who believe in this country's founding principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence to do likewise. In my administration, you shall all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of the color of your skin or your country of origin. For this was not only the original intent of this country's founders, but the intent of the only being ever fit to call himself our master, God himself. That is why I ask you to support me, Edward Coles, and my campaign for governor. Thank you.
Yes!
Yeah!
Freedom!
The Pala in the Montpellier Plantation House, late 1822.
Furthermore, an anonymous author has claimed that While Edward Coles has emancipated 6 or 8 of his elderly Negroes, he still holds in bondage many Negroes in a neighboring state. Given Cole's sudden emergence on the political stage, we need to take such claims seriously, and we need to question whether the son of a plantation owner is the true anti-slavery candidate this state deserves. Why, the filth, the scandal, the blatant lies, and to quote anonymous authors on top of everything. I'm sorry. You didn't want that returned, did you?
Not at all. I had a feeling you would respond in that manner, Dolly. That was why I brought it to Mama first.
Well, how is your mother? And what about Isaac?
Mama's health isn't what it once was. But, she's managing. And as for Isaac, well, Isaac is Isaac.
Well, James is doing his best to meet you before your departure. He was a little taken aback as to the timing of your visit. I must admit, so was I.
You believe I should have stayed in Illinois? For what possible reason? The election results will be a massacre.
You don't know that.
You've read what the press has been saying about me. I've fought back in letters, but in the end, it's my word against a word that's believed by the masses. Running for office was an idea, a noble idea, but in the end, it was no different than Sisyphus pushing his rock up a hill. I first read that story in a book President Monroe loaned me. He wished me luck when I first announced my candidacy.
So did Thomas Jefferson, if I recall.
You ran for me, Miss Dolly.
Oh, yes, Paul. Clear the table and get rid of that newspaper.
Right away, ma'am.
Dolly? Dolly?
James, we're in the parlor.
Sweetheart, I've been trying to reach you. Edward? Edward, you're still here.
James, what on earth is going on?
What's going on? I'll tell you what's going on. He won! Did you hear that? You won!
No, that can't be right. Not with the way the press has been going after me. Not to mention my opponents.
To hell with the press. And as for your opponents, James Moore received 7% of the vote, Thomas Brown received 28%, Joseph B. Phillips received 31%, and you, Edward Coles, received 33%. You're already the talk of Washington City. Oh, Edward's son. Governor, you won!
Governor? Yeah. Governor?
Yeah.
Oh, congratulations, Edward.
Oh, thank you, Dolly.
Oh.
Thank you, James.
Congratulations, Mr. Edward.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. My fellow Illinoisans, I stand before you, knowing many within the General Assembly never envisioned I would be addressing you as an elected official. Looking back on the past few months, I too was skeptical of this moment ever coming to fruition. But now that it has, I find myself with the distinct privilege of addressing you as governor. Over the past year and a half, I made slavery a key issue throughout the campaign, and I intend to make it a key issue for the welfare of this state moving forward.
Oh, boo!
The intention of the framers of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was that slavery should cease in the region north of the Ohio River, yet slavery still thrives within this state. To honor these intentions, I instruct you, the legislature, to make just and equitable abrogation of this institution. Justice and humanity require us to reform this state's laws so that they more accurately reflect the nation's Republican principles.
All right. Yeah.
I promise that any differences of opinion which might emerge during my tenure will be an honest difference. And I vow to do all I can to promote harmony between the branches of government. Thank you.
Yeah.
My fellow Illinoisans, although Governor COLES has only been in office for a mere few weeks, he has already managed to set our state back in years. The governor claims he embodies the nation's Republican principles, but I assure you he does not. For a man who embodies Republican principles do not insist on putting government over people and purposely divide those who oppose their rule.
Yeah! Woo!
Thanks to Governor COLES, the legislature of this state has been split into two factions. One of those factions consists of men like him who oppose slavery. The other consists of men who recognize its immense value and economic benefits. Since COLES divides the legislature with his hostile rhetoric, both chambers have now been investigating his sensational claims that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 abolished slavery. While there is still debate to the legitimacy of his claims, one debate has been settled. The only way to properly address the issue of slavery is to leave it up to the people. That is why I, Joseph P. Phillips, and my colleagues call upon the state legislature to pass a resolution calling for a convention to revise the Illinois state constitution. The people of this state will not be bullied by an antagonist like COLES, who views himself to be above the control of the people. I say to you proudly today, convention or death. Convention or death.
The study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward COLES.
What exactly happens in a constitutional convention?
During a constitutional convention, certain aspects of a state constitution can be called into question and voted upon by the voters. In the case of Illinois, my opponents wanted a constitutional convention so they could change the Constitution and legalize slavery within the state.
You're telling me as long as someone called for a convention, they could legalize slavery?
2/3 of the state's legislature had to pass a resolution calling for a convention. After that, it would be up to the voters.
And did they get a 2/3 majority? How could they get 2/3 of the legislature with a governor like yourself in office?
You're forgetting the state legislature never wanted me to win in the first place.
Well, surely you had the voters on your side.
Oh, not quite. Remember, I barely beaten Phillips, and my other two opponents had split the remainder of the vote. I soon found myself in another uphill battle whose outcomes threatened the state where my companions had finally experienced freedom for the first time in their lives.
Did you have any allies in power?
Few and far between. There was one official who shared my anti-slavery views. His name was Daniel Pope Cook. Daniel was the state's first attorney general, later a congressman. He was a good friend, and above all, one of the few men I trusted following the appalling turn of events. We would meet frequently at my governor's residence, where we would discuss our plans to avert the impending crisis threatening our state.
Convention or death! Convention or death!
That sounds like our esteemed Justice Joseph B. Phillips.
That's because it is. I've always wondered what the B stood for. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing bullshit.
The man's voice has quite the distinctive sound, as does the sound of fingernails being scraped across a chalkboard.
Oh, please, Edward. That's an insult to chalkboards. Not to mention one's fingernails.
Who else is out there?
Let's see. Ooh. We have our esteemed senators, Smith and Kinney, all followed by an esteemed crowd of followers. Well, Governor Coles, did you ever think you'd be leading such an esteemed assembly?
It's been one of the many surprises I've encountered.
Believe me, there are plenty within this state who oppose all that's been happening.
But how do we reach them, Daniel? Four of the 5 major newspapers support the convention, and the one that doesn't still hates me.
Okay. The friends I have left in the press told me the Illinois Intelligencer will likely be up for purchase at the end of the year. If that does happen, we could purchase it. Install some anti-convention writers on the staff.
We can't bet everything on the hope of purchasing a newspaper within a year. Voters are being convinced to support the convention now.
Okay. You can always write your own pieces and get them published. The papers may be hostile to you, but they can't deny you your freedom of speech.
It's a start. Why would the public feel obligated to turn my opinion piece on page 6? Turn to my opinion piece on page 6 when they've already read an attack piece on me and our movement on page 1? Do any of your friends have the means to print material on their own?
The only friend I have with experience in independent printing is in Philadelphia. His name is Nicholas Biddle, and he's an anti-slavery advocate like us. Unfortunately, I don't see how my friendship with him would benefit us there, or rather here, in Illinois.
Equa, what are you still doing here?
I was about to leave, but then I saw the crowd. I decided it'd be best to wait.
You made the right decision. I apologize for their loathsome behavior.
Oh, please don't apologize. If you go apologizing on behalf of every idiot in the world, you'd be saying sorry from dusk till dawn.
Yeah, I tell you, Edward, this housekeeper of yours has expressed more common sense in the past few seconds than any of those dolts there have expressed in years.
It's good to see you again, Mr. Cook. How's about some drinks?
You don't have to offer us anything. Your shift's over. You don't need to keep working.
This isn't work. It's pleasure. Okay, the staff and I have been meaning to give you this for a while, but you've been so busy. Reckon we could open it now, eh? I thank you for allowing us to work here.
Thank you, Equa. I'll be sure to thank the rest of the staff as well. It was completely unnecessary.
Oh,
Completely unnecessary and yet needed now more than ever. Would you care to join us?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Cook, but I don't know if I should.
You're more than welcome. I believe there's an extra glass near where you practiced your reading in the dining room.
Thank you. Make sure you don't drink it all without me, huh?
Aqua, man. She's a sweet girl. Meeting her and the rest of your companions only makes me want to fight even harder. That's good. Be sure to give my compliments to your staff.
Do you think it's wise for you to be drinking, Daniel? Especially given what your doctor said?
If I've learned one thing from seeing doctors all my life, it's that one must embrace moments like this when one can. The problem with always waiting for tomorrow for good news is that sooner or later, tomorrow stops coming.
Seems that crowd is finally starting to leave. If you would be so kind.
What is that?
A pamphlet. It's from Governor COLES' library. I've been learning to read, so he lets me borrow them. They only have a few sentences on each page, and they use words I can understand. They're much easier to read than books or newspapers.
You'll be reading plenty of books in no time. Newspapers, too. Although, you're certainly not missing anything by not reading those. Daniel? What is it?
What is it? This is the answer to our problem. And it's been under your nose this whole time. Why, if it was any bigger, it'd crawl right up your nostril.
Aqua? Exactly how strong is this liquor?
Pamphlets, Edward! Pamphlets! We get my friend in Philadelphia to print as many of these as possible. And then we include all the facts on slavery, its evils, its moral costs, its social effects, and why a vote in favor of the convention is a vote in favor of slavery. Then we take the pamphlets and distribute them to all the voters.
You really believe we can go up against Phillips, his allies, and the major newspapers with these?
Don't get me wrong. We'll still campaign in every town and city within our borders. Only this time, whenever voters attend one of your speeches, they'll get one of these. If the newspaper refuses to print the truth, we'll print it our damn selves.
I don't know.
Why are you doubtful? To quote your housekeeper, they are much easier to read than books or newspapers, not to mention far, far easier to distribute.
If there was a pamphlet on slavery, you'd be giving the people proper knowledge. And as my father once said, when you have knowledge, you have a certain level of freedom.
Wise man, your father. What? Daniel, how quickly can you get some printed?
I'll write Nicholas a letter in the morning. He'll fill me in with all the details. One of us will need to travel to Philadelphia to collect the pamphlets once they're ready for distribution. We can decide who later.
I'll help you any way I can, as will everyone who came with us from Virginia.
Looks like we've got a plan to set out before us. Now, how about a toast? A toast to our impending victory.
I wouldn't do that if I was you, Mr. Cook. Bad luck to be toasting to a victory before it happens.
Okay, how about a toast to better days then?
I can drink to that. To better days!
To better days.
The study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward Coles.
Given everything Daniel has done for our cause, I thought it'd only be fair for me to travel to Philadelphia.
Philadelphia must have made quite the impression on you for you to move here so many years ago.
Well, a lot of it has changed. The reason why I fell in love with this city remains the same.
This reason wouldn't happen to be a person, would it?
Nothing manages to sneak its way past you, does it, Hester? Upon meeting Daniel's friend, I was introduced to his inner circle of associates. And one of those associates had a niece, a rather beautiful young woman named Sally Logan Roberts.
Must you go so soon, Edward?
I'm afraid the situation requires it. I deeply appreciate all your uncle and his friends have done for the cause, not to mention all the help you've given me.
I would hardly consider having dinner with you and accompanying you on your mid-evening walks helpful. Although I certainly enjoyed all the time we got to spend together. I enjoyed it immensely.
As did I. I was referring to what you've done to inform others here about what's been happening in Illinois. It truly helps.
Forgive me, but I don't see how.
The problems plaguing one state are never just contained to that one state. As someone who has had the privilege to travel both domestically and abroad, I can tell you what affects one place will ultimately affect another. That's why it's so important for all of us to come together and spread the word whenever we can.
I really wish there were more men like you in Congress, Edward, and in the world in general. You will write to me about the convention, won't you? And you'll write just for the sake of writing, too?
Yes, to both. Goodbye, Sally.
Goodbye, Edward.
They share a kiss.
Those in favor of the convention often address how slavery will improve the economy and our lifestyles, when the truth is, it is those in the free states with the booming economies and the prosperous lifestyles. The only way Illinois can truly prosper is if slavery is excluded from our region.
Thanks to Governor COLES, I stand before you as a former slave. I can attest to the governor's character, and I can attest that what he says about this convention is the truth. And now for the man himself, Edward.
My associates and I have printed a series of pamphlets for you to read as you contemplate your vote. They contain the facts concerning slavery as well as quotes provided by former slaves. We implore you to read these as they contain information the newspapers refuse to tell you. Our critics love to chant the phrase, convention or death. Well, I am here to tell you that a vote for this convention guarantees the death of liberty and freedom as we know it. On August 2nd, I implore you to vote no on the convention vote. May God bless all citizens of this great state and this great country. Thank you.
Yay! Woohoo! Yay!
The study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward COLES.
When the people of Illinois cast their ballots on August 2nd, 1824, voter turnout reached 95%, and the convention was defeated by over 1,600 votes.
Thanks to you and your allies. Had it not been for all of your hard work, I doubt if there would have been a victory.
While it was a victory in some regards, it was a defeat in others. Some only voted against the convention because they didn't want more Negroes coming into the state. It was ultimately showed that some anti-slavery programs could only succeed if they promoted the interests of the free white man.
That is disappointing. I suppose in the end it's easier to change a man's vote than a man's heart.
Nevertheless, the election results left me and my allies hopeful for the future, or rather, the future we thought we had at the time.
God, imagine seeing the face of the Pope Convention supporters when they found out the results.
Or the men who work at the newspapers.
Oh, what say you, Edward? Whose reactions would you have preferred to have seen?
While I would have loved to have seen the look on Joseph B. Phillips' face when the news broke, I must agree with Equa and say I would have preferred to see the reactions of the men who work at the newspapers. You said this wine was a gift?
From my lawyer friends. They said it was the least they could do, given everything you've done for their practice.
What exactly have I done for their practice?
Edward, you've caused it to boom. They've had a plethora of aspiring lawyers wanting to practice law in Illinois because its governor honors liberty and justice.
Are you serious?
Absolutely. Why, earlier this week, I got a letter from a young man in Indiana who hopes to practice law out here when he's older. He even asked me if I would one day do the honor and introduce him to the admirable Edward COLES.
You told him I would be more than willing to meet him.
Sounds like you got quite the admirer, Edward. Better hope Miss Sally doesn't find out, or she'll be jealous.
Ah, yes, the lovely woman you were courting in Philadelphia. Ooh, well, if you decide to follow my lead and run for Congress, you'll have to move her out to Washington City with you.
Ooh.
Why, our future president, John Quincy Adams, can attend the wedding.
I think you're getting ahead of yourself, Daniel.
In terms of what? The idea of John Quincy Adams' presidency, or the idea of you marrying Sally?
Both.
Okay. Forgive me, but I can't help but feel optimistic. Our movement has never looked brighter.
Here's to all. Here's to all those who made this moment possible.
To Ralph!
To Ralph.
To Ralph.
Following the defeat at the convention, my political opponents sought to ignite a wave of personal attacks against me and my allies. From pro-slavery legislatures to refusing to approve my appointments, to my lieutenant governor attempting to stage a coup, to lawsuits claiming I had illegally freed my slaves, I found myself on a constant defense for the remainder of my term. As for Daniel Pope Cook, he was never elected to Congress again. He lost his bid for re-election in 1826 to Joseph Duncan, a future Illinois governor, and most devastating of all, a candidate in favor of slavery. Daniel, who had always been in poor health, further deteriorated following his political defeat. He died on October 16, 1827, at the age of 33. 4 years later, they named the home county of Chicago Cook County in his memory. Following the completion of my term, I sought to win a seat in Congress. I ran against 8 candidates and campaigned extensively on my success as the Illinois governor. Ultimately, I polled a distant third. My loss marked the definitive end of my political career. With John Quincy Adams' defeat at the hands of Andrew Jackson in the election of 1828, I found my country quickly changing in ways I had never imagined. And following a string of personal losses, both in Illinois and back in Virginia, I found my life changing in ways I never imagined as well.
Edward props himself in a chair. He takes a sip of wine before he reaches into his pocket and pulls out the ring he received from Thomas Jefferson. He becomes lost in examining the ring and does not notice Ekwa, as she now wears an engagement ring. I'll be leaving now. Edward? Edward?
Forgive me. I'm afraid I got lost in a daydream. Although it's certainly not daytime anymore.
Is that Mr. Jefferson's ring?
It is.
Oh.
Tom's been on my mind a lot lately. Especially with the anniversary of his death steadily approaching. The inscription still reads as clearly as it did on the day he gave it to me. It's strange. We've gotten older, and so many of the ones we've loved have passed. And yet, a ring, of all things, looks like it hasn't aged. Of course, its beauty is nothing compared to the beauty that's on your finger. That husband of yours has excellent taste.
As I've told you before, he's not my husband. At least not yet. Not until we get to Chicago.
Whether I remain in Edwardsville or relocate clear across the country, promise you'll write to me.
I promise. You know, when I first came to Enniscorthy, all those years ago, beaten, chained, and at the mercy of my new master, I never thought the boy who sat on the porch with a book in his hand would one day be the one to give me back the freedom I thought I had lost forever. I never imagined you, of all people, would somehow give me a life again.
When I sat on that porch, surrounded by a plethora of family and friends, I never thought the young woman my parents referred to as their property would one day be the one to remain standing by my side.
Come. Hey, let's save our tears and goodbyes for tomorrow. When it's time for me to leave, yes?
Yes. Until then.
Were you expecting a visitor?
A visitor? At this hour?
Yes. Rather tall and lanky. What did you say that word was?
Lanky?
Yes. Rather tall and lanky. Shall I turn him away?
Ask him who he is first.
Of course. Of course. Yes, yes, I understand. Okay. I will let him know. Thank you. He gave me this. Said it's a letter you wrote him.
A letter I wrote him?
Read it over best I could. You said if he was ever in this part of the state, he was welcome to visit you at this address.
Well, I'll be... appears our visitor was telling the truth. You send him in?
Of course. I can take your coat and hat?
You, ma'am, but I shan't expect you to work a minute extra on account of my impromptu visit.
Well, thank you kindly, sir. Good night, Edward.
Good night, Aqua. That was kind of you. A lot of my visitors won't even acknowledge her presence. I thought I had left that kind of behavior behind in the slave states.
I'm afraid bigotry doesn't take notice to state borders, Governor Coles.
Former Governor Coles. And your name is Mr. Lincoln?
Lincoln.
Lincoln? Sin?
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln.
Yeah, exactly. You got it.
Forgive me. As I'm sure you noticed when you read this, penmanship was never one of my strong suits.
Mr. Cook did try to warn me about that. I must say, you should have tried harder.
Mr. Cook? You wrote to Daniel Pope Cook?
We exchanged a series of letters when I was living in Indiana, right before he succumbed to his illness. He gave me your address and implored me to write to you. You, of course, were gracious enough to respond.
Wait. Were you the boy who wrote to him after the convention? The boy who wanted to become a lawyer?
Indeed, I was. A great deal has changed since then. As you can see, I am no longer an awkward boy, but rather an awkward man.
Well, I'll be. Exactly how old are you?
I'll be 23 this upcoming February.
You certainly don't look it. Then again, I imagine I still look like a boy at your age. Please, have a seat.
All right. First and foremost, I want to apologize for the hour of my visit. I was on my way to the nearest inn when I noticed the candles in your window were still lit.
There's no need to apologize. Although I am curious as to why you wanted to visit me in the first place.
The reason for my presence this evening is the same reason I expressed in my letter. I wanted to meet you. I wanted to meet the man who has brought hope to so many.
Mr. Lincoln, you are either an exceptionally kind soul or an exceptionally gifted liar.
Forgive me, Governor, but there's no such thing as a gifted liar. Why, the word gifted should never be associated with an action as morally repugnant as lying.
I'll go with you being an exceptionally kind soul then. Goodness. I'm afraid in my housekeeper's absence, I've forgotten how to be a proper host. Can I get you anything to eat? Anything to drink?
Thank you, but I ate earlier this morning. As for a drink, I've always hated the stuff. I find it rather unpleasant, and it always leaves me undone and flabby. Besides, I won't be staying long, given my journey in the morning.
Where will you be heading?
New Salem.
That's a wonderful village.
Illinoisians have told me it's a great place for those in search of a new beginning. They've also told me that your search for a new home may take you out of the state entirely.
It sounds like you've been paying a great deal of attention to gossip, Mr. Lincoln. Gossip and I have a somewhat tumultuous relationship. In fact, our relationship is almost as tumultuous as the one I share with the press. But in terms of the gossip you've heard, I'm afraid there is a great deal of validity to it.
Honestly, it makes me even more grateful that I decided to act on impulse. Had I not, I would have lost the opportunity to meet you entirely.
Understand. I've made no decision yet, but I will be making one soon.
It's interesting. We can make certain decisions without giving them a second thought, but for other decisions we can agonize over them until we've lost a good night's rest.
Believe me, I've lost many a good night's rest over this. While there is certainly a lot to keep me in Illinois, I do recognize I'm no longer an elected official. I also recognize my family and friends are all out east. Then there's the socialite in Philadelphia who I was courting.
Say no more. Whenever a woman enters the equation, a man's decision-making processes becomes a whole lot clearer.
The trouble is, whenever I think of leaving, I think of this state's welfare. I feel if I leave it entirely, everything my allies and I fought for will leave with me. In some ways, I feel like a general abandoning a battlefield before it's been secured.
I know it'll be years before I acquire your level of knowledge, but I've lived long enough to know when it comes to leaders like yourself, your legacies don't simply vanish into thin air. Those who have been truly inspired by you will always be there to pick up the torch. They'll remain on that battlefield no matter what happens.
It's not just Illinois that has me worried. It's the entire country. There have just been so many changes. So many destructive things this administration has done already. And when I think of that, the desire to remain here in a place I know has never been stronger.
I've always felt that politics was like a pendulum. Things swing one way under one administration, and then in the blink of an eye, a new administration comes along, and then things swing in the complete opposite direction.
Unfortunately, things have swung so far away from what they should be, I don't see them ever coming back.
I imagine that's what your slaves felt when they arrived at your family's plantation. Then you came along. And here they are, as free men and women, all these years later. You've set a pendulum in motion, and whether you remain in Illinois or travel back east, it will keep swinging. And while things may not be swinging in our favors at this moment, history has shown it's only a matter of time before they start swinging back our way again.
You have quite a unique way with words, Mr. Lincoln. You're going to be an exceptional lawyer someday. Although, if you want to be taken seriously, you must make yourself look older. Perhaps you should grow a beard.
Oh, I don't know about that, Governor Coles.
Please, call me Edward.
Very well then, Edward. Oh, goodness. Is that the time? That's even later than I imagined. Thank you so much for your more than generous hospitality.
Thank you, Mr. Lincoln, for, well, an evening I'll be sure to remember years from now. I'll be sure to remember the next set of letters we write to each other as well.
As will I. I look forward to receiving your letters, whether they come from Illinois, Virginia, or Philly. When you address them, feel free to call me Abraham. Or better yet, Abe. Mr. Lincoln sounds too formal coming from a friend.
That it does. Good night, Abe. Best of luck with the rest of your journey.
Likewise, Edward. Likewise. Good night.
This enterprise is for the young, for those who can follow it up and bear through it to its consummation. I hope that your success may be as speedy and complete as it will be of honorable and immortal consolation to yourself.
We study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward Coles.
After much prayer and much contemplation, I decided to leave Illinois. I came to Philadelphia, where I quickly resumed my courtship with Sally Logan Roberts.
I can't tell you how long I've been waiting to hear this part of the story. Ever since you first mentioned Mrs. Coles, I kept thinking to myself, when is he finally going to commit to her? I'm so happy you did.
Not as happy as she was. We were married on November 28th, 1833, and took up permanent residence in this city soon after. And we then took a post-wedding trip to Virginia. There I introduced her to family, friends, and by extension to a past I thought I had left behind.
Oh, it's so wonderful to finally meet you.
Oh, wonderful to meet you too, Dolly. I've heard so much about you.
Well, all positive things, I hope. Edward, your letters did not do this woman justice. She is positively radiant.
Darling, have you been misleading your cousin about my appearance this entire time?
Of course not. I've always mentioned how pretty you were.
How pretty I was. Edward, you're more than capable of writing better descriptions than that. After all, your writing did help you win the governorships and help you stop a constitutional convention. Not to mention, it made me feel like I was right by your side when we were worlds apart.
Your letters kept me company as well, in the good and the bad.
I can't believe it's taken me this long to meet the woman who's brought my cousin such happiness. We would have loved to attended your wedding, but with James's health the way it is, it simply wasn't possible.
You mustn't fret over such things. The important thing is, we're all together now.
Where is James, Dolly?
He's in his study. He rarely comes out of there these days. In many ways, he's like one of your books. Old-looking and frail, but still very much the same on the inside. He'd like a minute alone with you before he's introduced to Sally. Speaking of which, I was wondering if your bride would help me select some outfits at the upcoming Philadelphia spring clothes sales. It's evident we have similar tastes.
Ah, well, I would be honored. Thank you. It's not every day one receives such a compliment from a first lady.
So, now that your doctor confirmed the good news, have you two picked out any possible names?
Well, if it's a girl, we were thinking of Mary, but if it's a boy, we were thinking of either Edward Jr. or Roberts.
Mr. Edward, oh, wonderful to see you again.
Not as wonderful as it is to see you, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine. More so now that I can tell everyone I got to see Governor Coles again.
Former Governor Paul. Former.
You're still governor to me, sir. You're still governor to all of us.
My wife, Sally, is out in the parlor with Mrs. Madison. She would love to meet you.
I'll be sure to introduce myself right away.
Well, welcome home, Edward.
James, please. You mustn't exert yourself.
Oh, nonsense. I may be old, but I'm not dead. Besides, when you were a little boy, you always stood for me whenever I entered the room, and it only seems fair that I should award you the same courtesy now. It appears Illinois has been good to you, my friend.
Not as good as it could have been.
Tell me, do you still write to that young lawyer out there? I believe in your last letter, you mentioned his name started with an A.
Abe.
Hmm.
And yes, I still write to him. He even has a prospective client waiting for him. A man named Billy Herndon. I remember the name because Abe said he and I share similar views.
Well, I'm sure this Abe will have a long and prosperous career ahead of him. It's a wonderful feeling, isn't it? To know one's life is just beginning. It's like waking up and seeing the first rays of dawn on the horizon. Your friend must feel it, and I'm sure you feel it too.
Me? I would hardly say my life is just beginning.
Sure. You got plenty of years behind you, but you do have fatherhood in your immediate future. And from what I've heard, becoming a parent is like being reborn in a sense.
Sally and I are quite excited.
Oh.
She's under the impression it'll be a girl.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a strong inkling it'll be a boy.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, I shall teach our child all the lessons you and Dolly taught me.
Just promise you'll tell your child what I'm about to tell you now. I'm in the twilight of my life, Edward. As such, I've been thinking a lot lately, including a conversation that you and I had years ago. In it, you brought to my attention an issue that's guided every aspect of your life ever since. And, well, I dismissed your concerns, telling you that there was a time and a place for addressing such things. Well, I've come to realize that time is now. I intend to lay out a gradual emancipation plan within my will. This plan will ensure Dolly's financial security while simultaneously providing for my bond and bounded laborers. In short, I intend to free all my slaves.
You want to free them?
James Monroe, God bless his soul, once told me you had the tendency to struggle with coherent words and sentences. I never believed him until now.
Mr. President, for a man of your stature to do something like this, especially in a state like Virginia, I cannot begin to describe the impact this will have. Thank you, sir. Thank you, and God bless you.
Oh. Yes.
Well, given what we heard out in the parlor, we can only assume James has told you the good news.
He certainly did. He certainly did.
James Madison, 4th President of the United States, my friend and mentor, died on June 28th, 1836, at the age of 85. Much to my shock and disappointment, he died without freeing a single slave. Following her husband's death, Dolly returned to Washington City. As James had predicted, she spent her remaining years dealing with financial struggles. She eventually wound up selling their southern plantation as well as their slaves. Dolly Madison, my cousin and friend, died on July 12th of 1849 at the age of 81.
James, may I introduce you to my wife, Sally Logan Roberts?
It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. President.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. So refined, so naturally pretty. Like I told you before, boys eventually marry their mothers.
I don't know about that. I doubt Edward's mother sweated this much.
Hey, do you need anything, sweetheart?
Oh, a little more water, if it's not too much trouble. I know you warned me before we left, but I'm afraid I'm miscalculating the brutality of these Virginia summers.
Okay, well, let me get you some water then. I'll be back before you notice I'm gone. Isaac.
Hello, Ed. It's been a long time.
A very long time. I haven't seen you since,
Mama's funeral.
well, what are you doing here?
I'm here for a visit, same as you. I've been visiting Dolly and James quite frequently these days. Not sure if you've noticed, but James's health isn't where it once was.
Noticed.
We?
Sally is in the study with James and Dolly now. She'd love to meet you.
I'll be sure to introduce myself then. How is she enjoying Virginia?
A bit warm for her taste. In fact, I stepped out to get her some water.
May I take your hat, Mr. Isaac?
Paul, get some water for Miss Cole. For Miss
No.
Coles.
No, Paul. I'll get the water for Mrs. Coles myself.
You and Sally should visit Enniscorthy while you're here. Place is thriving. Papa will be proud.
I'm sure he would.
My family's home at the Enniscorthy plantation burned to the ground in 1839. As for Isaac, he survived the disaster only to die 2 years later in 1841 at the age of 61.
I know we didn't get to talk much during your last visit, but I wanted to express my sympathies over your failed congressional run. Must have been a hard blow. Tell me, was it worth it? Ed? Was it worth losing so much only to be forgotten in the end?
I can't say. Not now, anyway. But what I can say is this. The things we argued about, the things we debated, they won't be forgotten anytime soon.
It feels like it did before, doesn't it? Right before the war?
You really think it'll come to war?
I may not have climbed as far up the political ladder as you did, but I know this country well enough to know the next war it fights won't be a war with a foreign enemy. The next war it fights will be a war with itself.
In the darkness, an explosion of cannon fire is heard, followed by a flash of red, amidst the screams and pleas of dying men. They study in the Philadelphia home of older Edward Coles.
There are moments I'll always remember. The last time my husband held me before he passed. The night I gave birth to Henry. The morning I heard about the attack on Fort Sumter. I don't remember a lot of specifics about the attack itself, but what I do remember was the look in Henry's eyes when he heard the news. I knew then in those eyes would be seeing things I never wanted them to see.
I was in this room, looking at the shadows of things that had once been when I heard the news. After the war started, a part of me thought that if I kept coming in here, the world would somehow slow down. I thought things would slow down as they had done at Enniscorthy all those years ago, back when there was no conflict, no unanswered questions, no death.
You mentioned Sally was pregnant. Was it a boy or a girl?
It was a boy named Roberts. Based on what Mama and Papa told me, I imagined he looked the way I did when I was a child, except for the eyes. They were his mother's, the same eyes that made me fall in love. Over the years, Roberts developed all of his mother's sophistication and grace, as well as my curiosity and overall thirst for knowledge.
A light goes up, and Robert calls. He sits at Edward's old desk and examines a pamphlet. A uniform rests on the back of his chair.
Sally's family would visit often, and we would travel to Virginia frequently. As the son of a Northerner and the son of a Southerner, our son was equally exposed to both our worlds. They were the worlds that I thought would always remain united, and until that was until the attack on Fort Sumter.
After much deliberation, Robert sets down the pamphlet. He rises and begins to put on the uniform.
For Roberts, the Civil War that followed wasn't just a question of identity. It was a turning point that required him to choose between two places he called home. Eventually, he made his choice and thus pledged himself to what he truly believed in.
Roberts finishes putting on the uniform, and it is a Confederate soldier uniform.
I sat in this very spot on the night he left. I sat there praying that the look I had seen in his eyes would fizzle. But when I saw him standing there, I knew my prayers had fallen on deaf ears. For the boy I had once held, the boy I had once laid to sleep, had been replaced. He had been replaced with a vengeful soldier ready to fight for a cause that went against everything I stood for.
I'm leaving, Papa. It's better I do it now than wait for Mama to get back from her cousins. Give her my love and tell her I'll...
The only thing I shall tell your mother is that you're abandoning this immoral crusade and coming back to reason. Please, if you've ever had an ounce of love for me, then listen. What you're doing is wrong. You know it's wrong, and someday history will judge it to be wrong too.
Did history judge the revolution to be wrong, Papa?
This is not a revolution.
You're right. This is a fight for our fellow man. This is a fight for our homeland.
The South is not your homeland. Your home is here in the North with me, your mother, and those who defend liberty and freedom. And no fellow man, not yours nor mine, would ever embrace slavery.
Jefferson did. As did Madison and Monroe. You wouldn't be the man you are today had it not been for them.
Those men made mistakes, terrible mistakes, which they'll have to address in the next life. What they did on this earth cannot be undone. But what you're about to do can be undone. You can undo this. You can come back to me. If there's anything I've ever wanted in my life, anything I've ever needed, it's for you to come back to me.
Don't beat the drums of war unless you're ready to fight. You told me that once, and the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized our country has been beating those drums for years. Now is the time for us to finally answer their call.
Son, please.
I need to do this, Papa. I need to go against you for what I believe in, just as you went against your grandfather. My grandfather, rather, sorry. My grandmother and Uncle Isaac for what you believed in. Tell Mama I'll write weekly. Goodbye.
No, Roberts. No, Roberts.
Your son fights for the South? Your son is a Confederate soldier? All this time I've been working for you, all this time my Henry has been a moving target on the battlefield, and you never told me any of this?
I didn't tell you because there's nothing left to tell. Not anymore.
Philadelphia Inquirer, February 15th, 1862. Union forces triumph in the Battle of Roanoke Island. Correspondents at the scene have described dead bodies laying about in every conceivable position in a landscape littered with articles cast aside by the retreating foe. One such body was that of a well-dressed captain in the 46th Virginia Infantry Regiment. While his identity remained in question, in earlier reports now confirm the captain was Roberts Coles of Philadelphia.
What a shame, the writer observed, that the parents of this rebel soldier allowed his impulsive spirit to overwhelm his better judgment. He died as he lived, fierce, strong, and independent. It's my fault.
No, it's not.
None of it made a difference. Nothing I said nor nothing I did. All the sacrifices, all the uphill battles, all the hopes and prayers of achieving something better. Things are worse now than ever before. I need to accept these realities once and for all. I need to accept them before I leave this world.
It did make a difference. It made a difference to all of us who seek something better. People like me, people like my son, Henry. Men and women were freed because of you. Men and women who had only known suffering and pain from the moment they were born got to live their lives as free individuals. My son can live, dream, and fight for what he believes in because of people like you. No matter what happens today, tomorrow, or 50 years from now, what you started cannot be undone. You have lit a torch for all to see, and I promise you that for as long as I live, I will do everything I can to prevent that torch from going out.
Edward, where are you?
Sally, I'm in the study.
It passed.
What are you talking about?
The 13th Amendment. It passed in Congress.
It passed.
According to the latest report, by 2 votes over this required 2/3 majority. It was close, but in the end, it passed. Nonetheless.
Hi.
Edward, did you hear me? Congress passed the 13th Amendment.
He heard you, Mrs. Coles.
Slavery is abolished.
But in case you haven't learned by now, Edward sometimes has trouble forming coherent words and sentences. The fire in that torch just got a whole lot brighter, did it not?
It's the brightest it's been my whole life.
Is that the ring? The ring that Thomas Jefferson gave you?
It is.
Hmm.
I want you to give it to your son. Give it to Henry and tell him that if he ever questions what he's fighting for, if he ever feels the fire of that torch is dimming, all he needs to do is examine that inscription. It's the same inscription that inspired me when I first read it a lifetime ago.
Stand for freedom, even if you're standing alone. Thank you, Governor Coles. May God bless you. And may God bless America.
God bless America, Hester. God bless America, we all deserve.
The 13th Amendment was officially ratified on December 6, 1865, approximately 7 months after the Union Army's victory in the Civil War. 2.5 years later, Edward Coles died on July 4th, 1868, at the age of 81.
Henry Sawyer, Hester's son, wears his Union Army uniform.
Today, Edward Coles is best remembered for his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, emancipating his inherited slaves in 1819 and leading the campaign to stop slavery from spreading throughout the state of Illinois during the 1823 to 1824 convention contest.
While he may have been largely forgotten in history, the impact of Edward's work is still being felt in the America we know today.
Edward watches in delight as Hester hands Henry the ring. Once Henry places it on his finger.
May each of you continue to embrace your right to life, liberty, and happiness. For this was the intent of our founders, as well as the intent of the only being ever fit to call himself our master, God himself. No matter what setbacks befall you in life, always remember to remain standing. Remain standing for freedom, even if you're standing alone.
Edward Coles, Hester, and Henry remain as the lights go down. To Stand Alone, the untold story of anti-slavery advocate Edward Coles by Ryan Kaminski. A Jaillot Théâtre production. Edward Coles was played by Ollie Phillips. Older Edward Coles was played by Marge McGugan. Hester Sawyer was played by Lorraine Brooks. Isaac Coles, Daniel Pope Cook, Abraham Lincoln, Robert Coles, and Newspaper Boy was played by Matthew Kisenyo. John Coles, James Madison, and James Monroe were played by Bob Daniel. Thomas Jefferson, Joseph B. Phillips, and Confederate soldier were played by Stuart Fisher. Elizabeth and Equa and Sally Hemings were played by Jacqueline Elizabeth. Ralph Crawford, Henry Sawyer, and Paul Jennings were played by Emmanuel Catalan. Rebecca Tucker Coles and Sally Logan Roberts were played by Haley Elizabeth. Dolly Madison was played by Marsha French. This was based in part on the book Confronting Slavery, Edward Coles and the Rise of Anti-Slavery Politics in 19th Century America by Suzanne Cooper Guasco.